Okay, so this video is going to cover slides 6 and 7 because they are in fact related. So let's talk about what the research shows in terms of, is there any evidence that these, quote, sexually addicted persons have similar brain issues as other forms of addiction? Now, just go back for a moment in your head to our lectures on alcohol and substance use disorders and all the research I reviewed on the dopaminergic pathways in the brain, how excessive use of substances like alcohol, cocaine, methamphetamine, OxyContin, etc., changes the relationship activity-wise between the higher centers of our brain, like the prefrontal cortex, which is judgment-oriented and reflective and rational, and the so-called limbic system, like the amygdala and associated structures, like remember the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens and the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. Remember what the research showed about what happens. That part of the brain becomes excessively active, becomes hijacked. The higher centers of the brain that are typically reflective and judgmental and rational are dampened, and that supposedly is why alcohol and drug use becomes out of control of the user, according to the brain disease model of addiction. Is there any evidence? Because some researchers have argued that there is. Remember on a prior slide, I said there's not a lot of research that supports this idea for sex addiction, but there were studies done between a 3-year period of 2014 and 2016 where some researchers argue there is evidence that sexually addicted persons are having similar changes in the dopaminergic pathways of the brain as alcohol and substance use disorder folks do. So let's take a look at that. Until very recently, this evidence was lacking. It was mostly speculative, mostly theoretical, meaning there was an assumption that sex addiction would be influenced by the same pathways in the brain as alcohol and substance use, but there was really no evidence to support that. And the idea was, well, just like there's research on food addiction that uses the same dopaminergic pathways in the brain. We talked a lot about this, especially sugar and high-fat food. Well, the idea was, well, if drug addiction and alcohol addiction and food addiction seems to be underlied by this dopaminergic pathway dysregulation, well, sex addiction must be the same thing. It was speculative, it was theoretical, but it really wasn't supported by research. Then in 2014, researchers by the name of Voon and colleagues compared the brain activity of people who self-identified as sex addicts. So specifically in this case, people who were compulsive pornography consumers. So they're compulsively seeking out and watching or in some form interacting with pornographic materials. They compared the brain activity of these individuals to the brain activity of non-sex addicts and also to the brain activity of people addicted to drugs and alcohol. Here's what they found. When the people who were self-identified as sex addicts were shown pornographic images. So you have people come to a computer screen essentially and you show them pornographic images compared to control images that have nothing to do like with sex, like a picture of a landscape. What the study showed is that the brain activity in the dopaminergic pathways of the brain increased significantly, especially in 3 particular areas of that circuit for the individuals who were identified as compulsive pornographic users. This did not happen in the individuals who were the control participants, the non-compulsive pornographic users. The 3 areas involved were the ventral striatum, the dorsal anterior cingulate, and the amygdala. These are all critical structures in that mesocortical limbic pathway. Remember, we spent a lot of time talking about this in prior classes on substance addiction. That same circuitry in that reward pathway of the brain through which dopamine flows was strongly increased when that material was shown, but only for those who identified as compulsive pornographic users. The researchers see this as similar to what happens when you show images to drug-addicted persons or alcohol-addicted persons, images of drugs or alcohol. That dopaminergic pathway in the brain increases activity significantly compared to control participants who are not addicted and shown the same drug or alcohol images. Sex addicts' brain activity in this study occurred in the same areas of the brain and to the same degree of intensity as the brains of drug addicts when they are exposed to drug-related stimuli. So the idea is, look, any compulsive behavior, whether it's drugs or alcohol as a target or whether it's sex, in this case pornography, as a target, creates the same hijacking of the same brain areas. And this is evidenced by significant increase in activity as soon as the associated stimulus is shown to addicted persons. We don't see this happening in the same brain areas of individuals shown the same imagery who are not addicted to these targets, whether it be drugs and alcohol or whether it be pornography. So the researchers in this case concluded that the parts of the brain in charge of things like anticipatory pleasure, mood, memory, and decision-making about whether or not to continue that compulsive activity are activated in sex addicts exactly the same way they are with drug addicts. So remember when we talked about alcohol and drug addiction? The idea was the person has learned to associate the chemical release and the resultant pleasure. And not only that, but remember the importance of the activity. Remember, dopamine has been said to be more than a pleasure chemical. It also signals our brain that something is important to repeat for survival. So the idea here is just like after using drugs and alcohol repeatedly, you've trained your brain to believe this is an important activity. And the moment you see a cue to that activity, your brain anticipates getting it and begins to respond. That's that conditioning effect, that classical conditioning we talked about in the previous lectures on substance and alcohol addiction. Similarly, individuals who are compulsive pornographic users, sex addicts, and using pornography to fuel that sexual addiction have trained their brain so that in the presence of stimuli related to sex, their brains are responding just the way a drug-addicted person's brain responds to cues to drug use. And so the researchers draw this parallel to say, look, sex addiction involves the same pathways of the brain as drug and alcohol addiction. If you look on slide number 7, remember I said this was associated with the same conversation I'm having in this video about slide 6 and 7. They're related. I have a schematic of the reward circuitry structures in the brain involved in sex addiction research. And you can see the ventral striatum. You can see the medial prefrontal cortex that is being dampened or cut off by excessive activity in the limbic system, where the ventral striatum, where the ventral tegmental area, that VTA that was important in drug addiction, is being involved. And you can see from this schematic that the blue areas are those same areas of the brain, that same limbic system area that was involved, hijacked by drug and alcohol addiction. The green area, the prefrontal, the green area, the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, right, is being influenced also by drug use. And what's happening is the projections by drug use and by sex addiction. So those same areas, those blue areas, the ventral tegmental area and the ventral striatum, which is also in that limbic system area, is being highly activated by both drug use and compulsive sex, in this case, pornographic involvement. And they are projecting into the dorsal anterior cortex. This whole area of the brain is being hijacked. And eventually that purple area, the medial prefrontal cortex, is being dampened. So that purple area, the prefrontal cortex, that would ordinarily be an important check and balance on this pleasure-seeking center of the brain, is being dampened by the overactivity of that limbic system. And just like in drug and alcohol use, that dampening prevents the individual from having a stop system in sex addiction. It's just telling the person that not only is it pleasurable to engage in this sexual activity, but it's important and to keep seeking it out. And that stop system that we talked about in our alcohol and drug lectures, that purple prefrontal cortical region in the schematic in slide 7 is getting dampened over time, and it's not able to put a check and balance on the pleasure seeking of that limbic system. And the idea is the very same process that happens in drug and alcohol addiction is in fact happening in sex addiction. So I will meet you on the next slide.